Hello, everybody. I'm actually going to remember for the third week in a row to tell people who I am. So, hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Pithers. I run Genealogy Stories, a self-confessed history addict, and I'm joined every fortnight by various history guests from family history to today's guest, Rebecca, who's here to talk to us about witches. Rebecca, would you mind introducing yourself? Because I know you'll do a much better job than me.
Yeah, my name's Rebecca Rideal. I'm a historian, author. I do bits of podcasting and TV stuff as well. Yeah, a bit of a jack of all trades, but I do have a special interest in witches, although I have to flag from the start, I am not an expert. I'm just obsessed. So there we go.
There's something about witches, though, isn't there? It's. I was thinking about it through because I love kind of there's kind of popular culture things like Sabrina the Teenage Witch, big fan of the new Netflix series, and I know it's not quite the same, but Buffy the Vampire Slayer and things like that, and that kind of those kind of iconic images of witches have kind of filtered down and been modified and modified and modified as the centuries go on. And there's something really fascinating about why, why is it we're so obsessed with things like witches?
Yeah, I think it's because society's obsessed with women that don't conform. I think that's what it is, and we've lived in a patriarchal society forever, and anything that goes against the grain is always going to be of interest, even though these circumstances, these incidents, I should say, are exceptional. When you look at people being accused of witchcraft and stuff, I think that's what it is. It's just women. The patriarchy fearing deviant women.
No, I'd agree with that. It's that kind of whole mad, bad, and dangerous to know kind of category, isn't it? But I quite like the way that women, perhaps in this century, have kind of subverted that and kind of reclaimed the image of the witch, which is quite interesting. So, talking about now, do you know sort of when people first started talking about witches, or when the kind of concept kind of dates back to?
It's really interesting because I think the concept of a witch, the idea of a witch, is we can find it across all cultures throughout history, depending wherever you go. But certainly in terms of Europe and Britain and America, I think the idea of witches and women that dabble in magic and potions and that kind of thing, we get from classical literature. We get it from Medea, we get it from Medusa and Circe from the classical texts. And you certainly see in the 16th and 17th centuries, when these texts are being translated into English for the first time, that they make an impact. You find echoes of quotes and lines within the plays that are being performed on stage, with regards to Lady Macbeth, for example, being described in a similar way to the way Medea is described in Seneca's description of her. So there's lots. Actually, it might be Euripides. Anyway, don't quote me on that one. It's one of them, one of the classical writers. So that's a huge influence. But then, of course, obviously the Catholic Church has a lot to answer for when it comes to defining and categorizing women and men, it should be said, that are practicing these dark arts and using them to corrupt and cause pain and harm and that kind of thing.
So was witchcraft kind of, has it always been considered something dark, or even in earlier times did you get kind of good and bad witches, or is that very much like a modern concept?
So I don't know in terms of globally. I'm not going to lie and pretend I know. Yeah. I don't know. But obviously there's so much nuance when it comes to it. The witch as defined in law, witchcraft as defined in law from 1563, is a dark being. It's somebody that's practicing, colluding with the devil and using this collusion to cause pain and harm to others for their own gain or with their own wickedness. So that's that description. But then, of course, if we open it out and think about magic and potions and healing, then yeah, absolutely, these things have been around forever, and they've not always been seen as bad things. They're part of everyday life. When you think about paganism, when you think about the way different gods were worshipped in before the medieval period or during the medieval period, for a little bit of time as well. I think we've got it all there. It's there's good, there's bad, and I think we find that all over the place. But it's this definition of the witch, I think, that's the important thing that we get in the 16th century that changes things, and it changes the way that women and men are viewed when they're behaving in ways that are not typical to society or not accepted in society.
Okay. So so what, it's a really difficult question. I was going to say, what sorts of people are accused or tended to be accused of witchcraft? And I kind of, as I was thinking of the question, I was thinking, sorts of is kind of a bit difficult to define. But I guess, what were the people that were accused of witchcraft? What do you think led them to be accused of witchcraft is perhaps a better way of phrasing that question, maybe, hopefully.
No, I know what you mean, but I think it's again, it's really tricky because it depends on from place to place, and there have been so many different studies into different witch trials that have gone on. But the thing that strikes me, the kind of underlying theme throughout most of them, is that it's usually a consequence of underlying issues between neighbours and family members. I think that's the underlying thing. It's usually conflict that pre-exists, and the witchcraft accusations are where you see it escalate. And when the law, authorities are brought in, that's where it escalates to the level that it captures the attention of the authorities and makes its way into historical record, and that's why we can read about it. But when you're looking at these trials, there's definitely lots of tension going on between different people, and they accuse that, the accusations are bizarre for us to look at now. I mean, they're things like, a woman being accused of having a familiar sucking blood from a teat, in her private regions, and it's these things are very strange to think about. Or women or men, but mainly women, when it comes to England, being accused of destroying crops or creating magic that will kill cattle and that kind of thing. It's they're very nuanced and particular, these accusations, but it is the tension, I think, between family members and neighbours that's there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have an ancestor that was accused of being a witch, which is one of the reasons I was really excited to join you. So it was late 1700s, so very late 1700s, 1790s. So she wasn't like officially kind of brought in front of people and accused her of witch, but she got a job working as a servant, but kind of doing lots of odd jobs by the sound of it for the local reverend. And he was known to be a bit eccentric, even at the time, and he became more and more convinced that she was a witch, and so ultimately he sacked her on the basis that he thought she was a witch. But he was so obsessed with her that even a year later he was writing that the bees that she had tended to or taken honey from or something had disappeared the following year, and it must have been kind of a latency effect of kind of witchcraft. So he accused her of causing his horse to go lame. He had all these suspicions about her. From what I can gather, she was quite elderly and probably a bit hag-like. And that was literally her only crime. I think her face, didn't look very nice. And that would seem to be the entire basis of his kind of prejudice against her. But interestingly, she was still allowed into the birthing chamber of his wife when she was giving birth. So she was one of the sort of 5 or 6 women there helping with the midwifery. And afterwards, when the baby got sick, it was her fault. But he recovered. But interestingly, he had suspicions before he let her, before she was in this bedchamber. So it seems really bizarre to me that you'd think that maybe somebody might be a witch and then allow them to tend to your wife while she's in labour. So definitely a bit of an eccentric.
That's interesting. But also it kind of touches on the other thing to do with women during the early modern period, and always we're associated with life and death. We give life, and for centuries until male physicians got in on the act, we were always the ones that were delivering babies. We would later always be the ones embalming the dead as well and preparing them to before they were buried. So that association between life and death is something that is almost seen as like a mystical, mysterious thing that women can do and women know about. And I think that plays into this idea of deviance and having I don't know, something not quite right about you.
Yeah, yeah.
So was your ancestor in, did you say in the 1690s?
No, 1790s. So it was really late.
That's
Yeah.
really interesting, because the witch laws had changed then. So actually I can't remember the exact, was it in England?
It was in a very small area of Dorset, so near Turner's Puddle.
Okay, and
so
was
yeah.
she where are the records? Is it a family story that you're aware of, or are there
No.
historical records? Or
Yeah, there's historical records. So the Reverend kept a diary, and the entries are from his diary, and the place is small enough for me to conclude that there would have only been really one Susan Woodrow living there, and that's my 6 times great grandma, up an almost solidly maternal line as well. Just but yeah,
that's brilliant.
it's
I love
interesting.
that.
But the man that she married, the man that she married, he'd actually previously been married before, and lost his wife, and that wife had given birth to a pair of twins who I think possibly had a cleft palate. It's really difficult to interpret the burial records, but on the burial record there's quite a large note to say that they had facial deformities that made them look pig-like, and that the wife had been startled by a pig while she was pregnant, and obviously that was the cause. And I wonder whether that was some years before this reverend came, but I wonder whether there was talk about that in the village, whether that kind of unusual aspect of these twins, in fact they were twins as well, and their death, and then years later this reverend comes along and kind of maybe perhaps ties the two things together, even though they are actually different women, and maybe that fed into it. Her husband was possibly a gamekeeper as well, which would have made him incredibly unpopular within the village. So there's all these little tiny aspects that I've tried to kind of unpick as best as I can, and obviously I'm just interpreting a few pages in a diary and what I can glean so far. So yeah, it's been really interesting.
That's fascinating, because in the early 18th century, the law with regards to witchcraft changed. So no longer did the law officially recognize that witchcraft was practiced. What they did look out for were frauds. So people could be accused of witchcraft, but it would mean something different from the 18th century onwards. From a legal perspective, it would mean that you were being fraudulent and pretending that you had powers to help people when in fact you couldn't. So it's interesting that despite the shift in the legal terminology and maybe academic circles, there was still this underlying belief system, which is very much the case with your story of your ancestor, that they still believed in the occult, and that women were doing these things genuinely.
Yeah, that's interesting as well, because I'll have to check whether it was her or her mother. One of them definitely ended up, I found her in the Quarter Assizes, so she definitely she went to Blandford and was in some sort of trial, but it doesn't say anything about what she was accused of, and it's literally just one line. So it's tantalizing. But I can't quite work out, but maybe the two are related. I need to do some more digging. But do you going back a little bit earlier to when there could be trials, could anyone accuse anyone of being a witch? And if you did, what were the kind of steps that would lead from being accused of being a witch to kind of full-blown witch trial?
Well, so you could do it locally. You would obviously make the accusation, and you'd report it to the authorities, the constable, or a local important person. Then it would go to the magistrate, and then they could be, if the evidence stacked up, they could be tried. But then they also would do things to test whether women were witches as well. I mean, we all know the stories about women being dunked in water, the sink or swim type thing. But there were other things, whether women could heal wounds that had been inflicted, or if women, they would be searched to see if they had any marks on them that would indicate a teat that would be the devil's mark. Because of course we have to remember that witchcraft legally was not just an accusation of using magic. The subtext was that you were using magic that came directly from the devil, and that was where you were getting your power from. So it very much played into people's fears. And I think that the other aspect about the early modern period as well is that there was such a splintering when it comes to religion, particularly Protestant religion in England, Scotland, and the Netherlands as well, and other Northern European countries. There was such a splintering that people were worried about whether they were following the right path. Am I doing the right type of Protestantism? Am I, worshipping the right kind of way? And because so many extraordinary things happen in the 17th century that, if you have faith, you may think that it would be a sign that the end of days are coming. I think we have to remember this in people's mindsets as well. So there's lots of different layers to it. There's the local element and there's rivalry between neighbours and friends. But then there are these big themes from the 17th and 16th century as well that we find.
Hi. So, I mean, the witch trials in America, like the Salem witch trials, are obviously really, really infamous. Did we have witch trials, anything like that on a similar scale, or did we manage to kind of, evade that slightly?
There were lots of witch. Well, obviously Salem's the most famous one in America, but there were lots of witch trials in England, and there were specific areas that tended to be more prone to having accusations of witchcraft than other areas. So, the east, the southeast, Essex, Norfolk, were areas where you would have lots of witch trials. Also Pendle, which is probably the most famous episode, I think, in English history. But then if you go over the border into Scotland, you've got the whole load of stuff that was going on with James, King James, and his fascination with witchcraft. He published a text called Demonology that explored the occult, and he basically thought that witches were out to get him, but he was fascinated by them and interviewed women who were accused himself. One woman in particular, Agnes Sampson, is a big name when it comes to Scottish history and the history of witchcraft. So yeah, there were big cases, and there were big cases at the time, and you find in texts and pamphlets and things references to these things. Interestingly, the Royal Society was established in the 1660s, and it had a publication that accompanied it that was released, I think I've forgotten now, I think maybe once a month. It was called Philosophical Transactions, and the first ever issue, you'd think that it would all be about natural philosophy and things, and it was. But in the first issue, there was somebody writing to explain how witches are real and we should be wary of them. And this is, the Royal Society. So yeah, I digress, but it was very much something that was on people's minds, and they were looking out for stories of witchcraft, and that's why you find it on stage. You find references in poetry, in letters, and all the rest of it. Yeah.
So, and I'm guessing news of those trials would have spread. So, would you have known, if you were living hundreds of miles away on the other in like you said Essex, if you were living up in Cumbria or something, would news have travelled about these witch trials kind of orally through the country?
They travel orally, but they'd also travel in text form. Obviously, we're looking at a society that's not as literate at all as we are today. Urban areas were more literate, obviously. But then I guess when you think about what defines literacy, is it the ability to read or is it the ability to write? Some people could read, but may not have been able to write. And also people could listen. I mean, we spend most of our time, well, I do certainly, listening to audiobooks when I'm walking and stuff. So, lots of people were doing that. They were listening to stories. They'd have a reader, maybe in the family or the community, that would read these pamphlets, and it would be spread that way. But equally, there would be an oral tradition as well, with balladeers singing recognizable tunes, but changing the lyrics to fit whichever story was doing the rounds at that particular time. So there was all of that going on as well. That would be the way that news would spread.
I always think that's so clever with the melodies, because you have a melody that's familiar, it becomes really, really easy to learn the words to tell them to somebody else to pass them on. So yeah, I always think that's quite fun.
Yeah.
I just noticed we've got quite a few people watching, and I just wanted to remind people to feel free to comment and ask with any questions.
Hello everyone. Hello watchers. How are you?
Yeah, please feel free to comment and ask your own questions, because there were some really good questions on Twitter which I have noted down actually. One of which actually was which I've just got up actually, which is from Brooke Waldridge, who asked what as a witch finder. So who was a witch finder general, and did they keep records? And I guess I had a question where I kind of associated that with America, and I wasn't sure whether we had witch finders in the UK or Europe. And And I wonder whether you knew.
Yeah, so we had that. They weren't official titles. They were people that declared themselves Witchfinder Generals. There's that famous film from the 60s or 70s that's just wild. But there were people that basically said, yes, I'm the Witchfinder General of this certain area. And for the life of me, the name of the famous one has just left me now. But I'm sure if people are at home watching, they can Google it. And Matthew Hopkins.
And I only know that from Terry Pratchett.
Yeah. Matthew Hopkins, that's it. So he was very famous. There were pamphlets about him, and there's a famous pamphlet that's got an image on it of him walking into a bar or a pub, and there's lots of different weird witchcraft acts going on. I think someone's licking a pig's bum or something like that. I don't know, but it's just all weird stuff.
Really strange Friday night.
Yeah.
Okay, so anyone could just declare themselves a Witchfinder General, but how would they make money from that?
Yeah, they'd make money from it for sure. But also, it's a power trip, isn't it? It's absolutely all about power and influence. And the Witchfinder, that Matthew Hopkins emerged during a time of huge upheaval as well, the mid 17th century in England. And, you know, when you have things like that happening, civil wars, regime changes, all the rest of it, you're going to have egotistical maniacs that want to take advantage of the situation. The world turned upside down is what they referred to it as. And that's what he did. He basically went on a bit of a rampage and was looking for witches. I mean, it takes all sorts, doesn't it?
I was going to make a height-related joke and then thought better of it. Did they? The other question related to that was, did they keep records? So, did the Witchfinder Generals keep records, or does our records of witchcraft trials come from central court records or local court records?
They come from the local courts. I mean, I'm sure there would be people that were making notes and writing down what they'd seen and things, but most of the accounts that we have come from the court trials and testimonies from witnesses and things like that. So that's where we get most of our information from when it comes to witch trials, and official ones as well, because there's lots of stories about witches, but we don't always know whether they're true. They could be sensationalist literature that's written as a warning to others rather than actually being based on truth.
Yeah, and of course, I suppose you don't know how many people started to feel like neighbours were looking at them suspiciously, started to feel a bit of heat, basically, and just moved and just upped and left. You know,
yeah.
I mean, I
do that.
I think I'd leg it. Definitely.
Yeah, I think so. Although that said, I mean, in reality, it's hard to move in these. I mean, people did move around England. Obviously, they moved around during the early modern period, and lots of people moved to London. But it is hard to move. People lived in communities, like small communities, and they lived within these communities their whole life. You know, they'd be marrying their second or third cousins from around the corner. It's, you know, I'm not saying everyone's inbred here, but there's a bit of that. These communities were small and people stayed where they were. I mean, you'll know that from being a genealogist.
Yeah, no, and when I say leg it, I mean it would probably literally be on foot, wouldn't it? Potentially, you know, like you could have the money to get a horse or hire a horse, or
you could just
on the back of a wagon, or
you would ride your familiar, couldn't you, or your broomstick?
You could,
that's how you get out of the way.
Where on earth does that come from? That idea. So there's certain like troops, like the big witch's hats, and I was curious as to whether you knew where any of those kind of stereotypes came from.
Yeah, so I think there is a reference to the first broom that's used. I can't remember when it dates to, but I think it's the early 16th century, but I could be wrong. It might be the 14th. But they certainly, in terms of imagery, the witch looked as we would imagine a witch to look in the 16th and 17th centuries. They would be on a broom. They would be, you know, they would be wearing a hat. Other depictions are just basically naked women around a devil with horns and stuff. But yeah, those witch symbols that we've come to heavily associate with witchcraft were there then and being spread around. And that's what people were looking out for and keeping an eye out for.
Okay. And so if you were accused of witchcraft and it went to trial, what happened? Do we know anything about what happened to people who were found innocent?
Yeah, they just get on with they could get on with their own life. So one of the final cases for witchcraft in terms of the original meaning of it, meaning that someone was practicing witchcraft to cause destruction to other people. The woman, again, I've forgotten her name. I'm so sorry, listeners. I'm a terrible interviewee today. But she went on, and she was basically taken under the wing of a local beneficiary and lived on his land until she died later. So people could get on with their lives. Obviously, in those circumstances, when you'd been to trial, it's really difficult to live in the same area again. So they tended to move a little bit away, but not miles and miles away, just maybe to the next village or something.
Okay. Oh, I find that really interesting. And so when you went to trial as well, what kind of evidence did people use to try and back up their accusations? Was it, presumably it was all just oral testimony of I saw this, and other people say, yeah, I saw it too.
Yeah, it would be that. Or they'd be looking for poppets and things like that in people's homes, like little dolls, kind of like, as we'd imagine, maybe a voodoo doll or something. They'd be looking for things like that, or unusual things in the homes of the witches. They'd do searches. But yeah, most of it would be down to testimony. And the testimony, as I said before, would be really, really specific and random at the same time. It would be things like they saw so-and-so chatting to her familiar, which is a black dog, or they saw another person whispering into the ear of a cow, and then all the cows belonging to someone else would die, or they saw someone placing something under a pillow of a baby, and the baby died shortly afterwards, or they noticed a mark on this woman, or pinpricks. It's very strange things to us, but they meant a lot to the people back then, and they had symbolism and significance.
I can understand. Well, obviously I can't understand because I'm not living in the time, but I can kind of empathize, maybe for want of a better word, with that idea of if you don't know physically what causes certain things, why that then you might think that was, and you're very religious, why that might spook people, I guess. I mean, and in terms of those creepy dolls, we found some in the cottage that I lived in when I was a child, renovated.
Oh, wow.
They are really creepy. So yeah.
Wow.
Just got a question from Lee Clements. Was it mainly working class women who were accused?
It could be a range, but yeah, working class mainly. That said, I always flag when I'm talking about the early modern period that our notions of our class system that we've inherited from the late 18th and 19th century and 20th century. We're in the 21st century now, aren't we? That wasn't thoroughly applicable to the early modern period. The class system was slightly different, but I know what you mean. People that were very much lowest down on the social hierarchy. Yes, they were mainly the ones that were accused.
Yeah, people with the least power, I'm guessing, most vulnerable.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then I've heard that some people confessed that yes, they were using witchcraft. I'm like, my completely ignorant guess would be the same as confessing something under torture. It would be just meaningless. But do we have any evidence that people who confessed actually did believe that they were using magical powers, or
I think some people,
yes.
Yeah, I think some people did believe it. I think some people did, or they may have become so sleep deprived and anxious under duress that they not necessarily confess to something that they haven't done, but they start to believe that maybe they had done that. Maybe that's what was going on. Maybe they were a bad person. Maybe that thing that they did when they were a child that they've kept secret for all these years was actually, really bad, and this is their punishment for that. I think there's a whole raft of psychological things going, at play when it comes to these false confessions of witchcraft, because we know, this is why we're so interested in it, I think, because we know, I mean, sorry if this bursts anyone's bubble, but we know witchcraft isn't real. We know there's no such thing as magic in the sense of, making potions to turn things from one thing into another. We know that's not true. So when we look back at these cases and when we look at witchcraft stories, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that's unstoppable. We can see the moment that accusation is made, whether the person is, goes to trial, whether the person is convicted and found guilty, doesn't really matter, because that label's with them forever then. And I think that's why we're so interested in it. We're also really interested in witchcraft now, women, I think in particular, because it, as you touched upon at the beginning of this talk, it's empowering, I think, in a way, to think about these things that women for so long have been told was wrong about us, that, we're not supposed to have agency. We're not supposed to be clever. We're not supposed to have foresight and want to better ourselves. We're not supposed to wear clothes that aren't, I don't know. We're not supposed to do so many things, but we're starting to do that now. And I think one of the main interests for me when it comes to witchcraft is obviously the history, but also I'm really interested in the intersection of history with pop culture and the different types of witches that we see throughout the 20th century and the 21st century, and what that says about society, because it's almost like there's a witch for every age. And what does that witch mean? And why are we presenting witches in this particular way at this particular time? Why did we have Bewitched in the 1960s? Why did we have The Craft in the 1990s? Why have we got Sabrina the Teenage Witch right now? Why have we got a discovery of witches? Why have we got all these things? Why are most witches that are depicted on TV and films, why are they usually white and blonde? Why is that? What does that say about society as well? So I think there's such an interesting conversation to be had, and just to look at, if you just look at recent films, to think about why was it depicted in that way? Who has the power here? Is it the woman that's accused of being a witch, or is it someone else? That's why you mentioned Buffy. She has the power. It's about the supernatural, but she's the one with the power, and that's why we find her interesting. And I'm having a bit of a ramble, so sorry.
I'm nodding like furiously, because I completely agree, and I find like Sabrina particularly interesting as well, because when you look at that, she's a young girl who's kind of being put upon, I suppose, being made to conform, although that conformity is interestingly a subversion of our conformity. But at the same time, she's using her powers to again subvert that and then embrace the bits that she wants to embrace. And I think that's really interesting. It's a really interesting concept, and I think there's something really alluring, and again, it's similar in The Craft, although that kind of all goes horribly wrong. There's something so alluring about being able to be in control, if not of your, not just of yourself, but potentially of the other people around you as well. And that, and going back to the past, I can kind of, when you were saying about people confessing, perhaps because they began to believe it and began to doubt themselves, but I wonder whether there's also actually I did talk to those cows and they all died, and maybe that does mean that I've got some ability, and maybe that's attractive, even to confess that under the biggest duress. Obviously I don't know, just completely guessing wildly, but it's interesting.
I think it's, I mean, there can be so many reasons for someone making that kind of confession. And I'm sure at least one person believed that they'd done what they'd done, and, kind of serendipitously, it actually worked. I'm sure that happened on at least one occasion. But yeah, it's such an interesting area. I always find it fascinating as well when we look at witches in literature. I find it interesting that we had The Worst Witch that came out, I think it was the 1980s.
My daughter loves that.
Yeah, well, I used to love it when I was a child, and they were big books, and school children read them. But it was only when it was a boy doing the same type of thing in a different school, in a school that was basically the same but with a different name, that it took off. So why is it that boys are allowed to have that power, but girls in that world are the secondary characters? It's very interesting, all of it. I'm as you can see, I am not an expert. I read a lot, and I kind of geek out a lot and watch lots of films and things about witches, but I just love exploring it as a subject, because I think it says so much about society.
No, I do. Do you have a favorite witch, do you think?
Oh God, that's a really good question. Do I have a favorite witch? I really liked Circe in the recent book by Madeline Miller. Yeah, I really liked. I think she was my favourite. I liked the way that character was put together. But then, I don't know. Yeah, maybe her. I'll go with Circe, one of the originals, or maybe Eve. Now that's a question. Was Eve a witch?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. Yeah, really interesting question. I enjoyed Circe by Madeline Miller. I think that, it was interesting. I've got Pandora's Jar by Natalie, I can't remember her surname, on my bedside table ready to read as well, which is about women in mythology. And so it's an interesting topic. Sideline. Racheal has just.
It's not. It's the same. It's all the same, isn't it? And the other good book actually recently is The Familiars, by someone whose name again I've forgotten, but it's a good one.
I know the one you mean. It's on my reading list, and the book cover for that's really beautiful as well. Just not that matters at all, but it's on my Audible list. So Rachel's just asked, "Hi Rebecca, what's the most famous witch you have come across?" We have the Ensbury, I'm not sure that I'm saying all right, Ensbury witch in St Neots. The most famous witch, that's a hard one.
That is a hard one. I reckon probably Agnes Sampson in terms of Britain. She's probably the most famous one that we've had here. James's little bit of witch. I think it's not the famous ones that are interesting. It's the ones that you find in the archive that you didn't realise were there. So I was doing I'm from Chester, I live in Chester, and I was doing a bit of research in the local archives a few years ago, just into Tudor deaths for a research project I was commissioned to do. And I was really struck by the amount of women that were executed for witchcraft by Chester Castle. And you just think those histories are completely lost. And I would walk past Chester Castle quite easily, not really thinking about where I was. But then after I'd read that, you kind of walk past and you think, gosh, that's really sad. These women lost their lives because of a misguided perception of what was real and what wasn't. I mean, the law probably would have got them anyway somehow, but and
it's interesting that Anne Boleyn's quite often portrayed as a witch as well, isn't she?
Again,
I don't know if she was at the time, but later, I find that really interesting as well, what you said about you were in the archives and you came across these kind of untold stories, I guess, because I think it's really easy to assume, especially when you read history books and things, that actually all that, we've already discovered all the witches that ever were. Or I was reading something the other day and it was about Bonnie Prince Charlie and it was saying that it was until fairly recently they didn't think he had any descendants, living still descendants, and actually he does, and they've discovered them and tracked them down. And I was really shocked. I was like, surely everybody knows, like that should be, just they should
come over, take over, boot out the old lot.
I was only reading about it because I was watching Outlander. So.
Witches. There's witches in that as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. Yeah. But I just think it's a really important point that I think we tend to think that everything's been discovered or the names of the past are all known for these things that we consider a big deal now. If somebody was to be accused of a witch now, it would be like, in a sense, trial would be so unbelievably shocking. So I think, therefore, we sometimes put that on the past, if that makes sense.
I think the important thing to remember as well is this law change in 1563 when witchcraft became a crime, and witchcraft wasn't just a crime, it was a weapon. So if you look at homicide cases, witchcraft as a weapon of death it kind of skyrockets with regards to women after that point. And you'll find them in the archives. You'll find them everywhere in the archives where women have been accused of killing someone else by witchcraft, because you can't prove it, but you can't deny it either. So those cases are there very much for us to find, and you will find them. Everyone, go and find an executed witch. Go on.
Yeah, Jane here actually says, how common was it for witches to have been widows? Which is quite an interesting question.
In terms of statistics, I don't know offhand, but common in terms of my kind of anecdotal research that I've been doing. Yes, absolutely. It was women that were widowed, but also women that were known and recognized as healers. The woman that you would go to for your your willow bark or something, if you had a headache or that kind of thing, you'd go to these women, and because they already knew about potions, then of course, if they were getting a bit annoying, and there was some beef in the village, you could accuse them of being a witch.
Yeah, and I always wondered about women that you went to perhaps to try and help you prevent a pregnancy or get rid of an unwanted pregnancy potentially, and how vulnerable they were really to being accused of witchcraft, especially if somebody had if a man found out or somebody changed their mind, and regretted their decisions or whatever. But
yeah, absolutely.
Whitney here says, what are your thoughts on the rise of witchcraft practices among young women 20 to 30 years old, and the evolution of the social notion of what is a witch and what a witch looks like? And I think Whitney might be referring as well to the modern practice of Wicca.
Yeah, I mean, whatever floats your boat. If you want to do it, do it. It's interesting, and beliefs and spiritualism, they evolve over time, don't they? So it fascinates me. I don't practice that kind of thing myself, but I'll show you the earring I'm wearing, because the other one fell out. I have my earring in. I like the imagery and the symbolism of it all. I've got a call with a priest after this, so I probably won't wear it, but I think it's really interesting, but also it's kind of, I don't think it's necessarily about the magic per se. I think it's about the sisterhood. I think it's about finding comrades and finding your own coven and your own group of people and feeling empowered to stand by one another. And you might not be able to hex the person that's annoyed you, but you can talk about it.
Yeah, it's very appealing. So I think you probably answered this earlier a little bit, actually. So how and kind of how, why, and when, I guess, did witchcraft trials die out? What kind of, you were saying about the change in law around the turn of the century, and I just wondered when, why, how that kind of led up to it.
Yeah, there's lots of reasons as to why. There were conversations that were becoming much, much more frequent about the kind of reality and the truth of magic and witches. And obviously by the end of the 17th century and going into the 18th century, we're moving into a phase of spiritual understanding, and not spiritual understanding, we're moving into a phase of understanding where people are starting to question religion itself. I mean, we call it the Enlightenment. I don't think that's the right term for it, because it came with so many horrors for so many people. But in terms of intellectual thought, that's certainly there. And I think we see the seeds of that in the late 17th century, and people are starting to question, is magic real? Like, did they really, Mary down the road, did she really chat to the devil to get that, for those sheep to die? I don't think she did. I think a lot of on the ground chatter like that, but also there's intellectual discourse as well that's going on.
Okay. Did you ever has there ever been any kind of big apologies to the women that obviously lost their lives after being accused of being witches? I mean, I'm guessing again, like, that if you were found guilty, the sentence was death.
Oh, sorry, I think my internet might be cutting out a little bit.
Oh, no
I don't
worries.
know if I heard the last bit of that, but
that's okay.
In terms of an apology, I think there was something I was reading recently that there was going to be some kind of movement in Scotland to make an apology to the women that were accused and executed for witchcraft there, but I could be wrong on that front. I don't think so. I mean, I don't know. I don't know about historical. I don't know about apologies for historical things. I'm not sure. I don't feel like I'm educated enough about it, and I'm not, I'm not a witch, so I don't feel like it wouldn't emotionally impact me if there was apologies for these women. But I don't know. What do you think?
I kind of agree. I think it's really difficult to apologize things in the past, because we're not there now. I think, yeah, I guess there's a difference between acknowledging and apologizing, and I'm not quite sure where the line is in a way.
I mean, obviously
really
there's obviously different, I guess it's not a one solution for all, because there's so many aspects of human history where apologies are warranted because we are still living with the consequences of those atrocities. I'm not sure. I mean, on a society level, yes, we're still living with consequences of the patriarchy. I don't think the individual witch trials perhaps have made a mark on, still make a mark on our contemporary life. Whereas with other forms of discrimination, we definitely see that still affects the way the world works.
No, definitely. And there's not a whole society built on top of that either, if you see what I mean. So there's not an entire society built off the suffering of the witches, where other kinds of discrimination there definitely is. So no, I agree.
Exactly.
And what I was going to say, the other question I asked as well was, when I cut out, was if you were found guilty, was the sentence automatically death, and was that by burning at the stake?
It was by burning at the stake in Scotland, not in England. You would be hanged in England. And it depends on the crime, because if you are found guilty of using witchcraft to murder your husband, then the punishment for that would be being burnt at the stake, because that was referred to as petty treason, and petty treason was a crime against society, and that's the way you would die. But ordinarily, despite being burned at the stake, you would be killed usually beforehand and just roasted on there for a little bit after. So it's it is the image that we have, isn't it, that people were burned at the stake, and they absolutely were, definitely in Scotland. And if you'd killed your husband for using witchcraft, you would be liable to have that kind of death as well. But if it was just witchcraft for, I don't know, destroying some crops or killing a servant or someone that's seen as lower than you in the social hierarchy, then it wouldn't be that punishment. It would be being hanged. And
if you were a man that had committed witchcraft and used witchcraft to kill your wife, would that have been petty treason as well?
No, because you're not committing a crime against the social order. It's just the way it worked. Then if a man had killed a king, that's treason. It's just where you are on that hierarchy, and women at that time were below men, particularly their husbands.
It kind of sums it up, really, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it's kind of like the ultimate illustration, really, isn't it, of patriarchal society?
Yeah. I know.
Okay. Just had a comment from Sue here. Healers using poisonous plants could get the dose wrong and cause harm, and therefore were certainly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Me too.
Oh, interesting one. Would people hire witches to kill a husband? This is my cousin Racheal that's commenting on this, which is why I'm laughing. Like, got something planned, Rach. Would people hire witches to kill? Sunny, watch out. Would people hire witches to kill a husband?
Assassin witches.
Yeah.
I love the idea of this.
Love that idea.
Great. I don't think so. People would, they might consult witches. I mean, James's interest in witches is fascinating, because I think he was fearful of them, but he was also really fascinated by what they could potentially do. So potentially, but then you would never confess to being a witch, because if you did that, and if people knew you were saying, yeah, I'm a witch, then you could be accused of being a witch, and that would come with not good stuff. So yeah, while I love the idea of witch assassins, I'm not sure how widespread, and also how we would know as well. I don't think it would be in the historical record. It would be something that you'd really have to dig to find, because they'd cover their tracks, wouldn't they?
Well, if you're a witch assassin, you definitely cover your tracks. I love that idea. There's somebody who wants to make a film. Jane was just saying here, she associates witchcraft with drowning, e.g. via the ducking stools. How common were the ducking stools? Was that, again, is that something that's kind of been mythologized, or actually, generally speaking, were ducking stools used during witch trials?
Yeah, ducking stools were used, but they weren't just used during witch trials. They were used on women quite a lot, actually. Women that would talk too much. They would be put on the ducking stool. There's a famous thing with one of Charles II's mistresses, and when the court was in Oxford during the plague, there was an inscription written on one of the colleges that said something along the lines of, and I apologize, I'm going to swear now, I'm going to say the F word, okay. So please close your ears if you don't want to hear it, and if there's children Actually, are the children watching? Am I allowed to say it, Natalie?
No, it's just yeah, go for it, and I'll try and beep it out.
I won't say it then. I'll hint it. So it was something along the lines, I've forgotten the rhyme now anyway, so it doesn't matter, but it was something along the lines of that she was spending so much time effing that she needed instead she needed a good ducking. So there we go.
Okay.
Sorry, children.
Don't worry. I know it's. I only hesitated because I know that some people watching are on the other side of the world, and therefore it would be early morning. Whereas here it's obviously late night. So,
well, I didn't say the word. I implied.
No, you didn't. You were fine. Oh yeah. That's totally for me. Oh, what was I going to say?
Sorry.
I was going to say there. No, that's okay. Is this the same era? Am I right in thinking they also had the bridle, the mouth? I can't think what it's called.
Yeah,
the thing that stops you talking.
Yeah, they did. They had that. The Scold's Bridle.
That's it.
Yeah. And you can find them in lots of local museums. They still use them on staff there. No joke. Yes, there are lots of them in local museums, though. They definitely were using them, and they were definitely using them to shut women up. And they're just these horrific things. I mean, if you wear one, you kind of look like Hannibal Lecter. It's just a horrible, horrible thing, and it really gives you an insight into this society in the 17th and 16th century and how women were thought of and treated. And it's horrible, really. And it's one to bear in mind when we celebrate, women writers from that time and, actors and things like that, that actually this was a really tough world for a woman to live in, particularly if you were poor.
If you were, could you recommend any female writers from that time, actually? Because I can't.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Aphra Behn. So she was a playwright from the late 17th century, and she wrote lots of works that have been celebrated over the years. I love a writer called Margaret Cavendish, not because she's a brilliant writer, but just because she's hilarious. She wrote a science fiction book about a woman that goes to the North Pole and meets lots of weird and wonderful creatures. Jane Anger was a writer as well. Her name Anger is brilliant because she writes kind of proto-feminist stuff as well. So I'd have a look at her stuff if I were you. I mean, there's loads of female writers from this time. They get overshadowed a little bit because of all the male ones too. But if you look, you can find them. Yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. I would definitely go and look some up. So probably start wrapping up. So if anyone's got any questions, please do pop them in the comments. But whilst you're having a think and doing that, is there any questions about witchcraft? This is a bit of a cheeky one, but is there any questions that you kind of wish people asked but they don't, that you always have to try and sneak in your thoughts on, or have I covered all my bases?
That's such a good question. I'll remember that one for when I do
I ask
sharing
it a
things.
lot.
It's a good one. I don't know. I think you've covered most of the things. The one thing that I like to make clear is that witchcraft was seen as a weapon as much as it was an accusation on an individual, and I think that's something that doesn't necessarily get appreciated enough. Is that it was seen as, in legal terms, it was a weapon. So there's that. But also I think I'm really interested in the pop culture of witchcraft and its legacy. And, from the vampire novels in the 19th century and supernatural things in the 19th century, all the way to Hollywood films and TV shows now, it's so rich. And you find it everywhere. You find it in children's books, adults' books. It's everywhere.
I always think it's really interesting, the monsters that we create at different periods or times, or the monsters that we reflect, are always a reflection back on us. So whether that's the baddies in the James Bond film reflecting the current politics, or Frankenstein and vampires, which are my personal favorite. So been hooked ever since Interview the Vampire. So right.
Haven't we all?
Yes, I know. Well, mostly because it had Brad Pitt in it, but yeah, we go. Thank you so much for your time, Rebecca. I've really, really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm sure I could quiz you more about witches. I know you've got your brilliant podcast, Killing Time. Is there anywhere else that people could go to find you and to find out a little bit more about your work and some of the things that you write on?
I'm kind of a bit stalled at the moment because I'm working a couple of projects that are going to take up my time for a few more months. But I'm hoping I run HistFest, which is a history festival that does events and other things. So I'm hoping to launch a batch of short courses, online courses this autumn, which would be great if you could check it out. The details will be on the website at some point. So yeah, I mean, if you're interested in different types of history, then there's going to be a range of courses there for you to look at.
I will, as always, do a blog post accompanying the video, which will be over at www.genealogystories.co.uk, and then there's like a twice removed page. But when I do that, I can put in a big link to your courses, and I can personally recommend them because I took your course on killer women, and I found it fascinating and really enjoyed it. So
well, thank you.
Thoroughly recommend. It was just, and it's, when you say course, it's also fun. It's not, I didn't feel like I had to do work or had to do homework, although I could have done if I wanted to. It was a leisure course, rather than something stressful. So it was really enjoyable. So I'm going to hit the end broadcast button. It will do that awkward thing where it takes a second to end, and we'll sit here smiling. But thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.